Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lesson 4. The title for Lesson 4 is Modern Liberalism. So the first thing you can do is, of course, add this title to your partial notes, but then you can take a look at your timeline, so that big white paper that you were given, and take a look at what you've written so far in your timeline. You're going to add a few things to this timeline to put some things into historical context today. So we've already learned about the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. Well, the next time period we talk about here, from the late 1700s into the early 1900s, we call that the Industrial Revolution. So you guys have learned about the Industrial Revolution and what life was like during that time, right? People embraced classical liberalism and laissez-faire capitalism. This was a time of limited government. This was the time of a big gap between the rich and the poor, and a lot of individualism, because people did not rely on others to help them out. They did not rely on their government to help them out. Instead, they were told to rely on themselves, right? Self-reliance was really emphasized during this time. Okay, so there's a few more things you can add. So you already added Industrial Revolution. Well, now you can add the rise of labor unions. Okay, so this happened in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Go ahead and add that. You can add World War I. That's going to be important for today's lesson. The Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. And you know what? I should add to this World War II. Okay, let's type that in right now. Okay, from 1939 until 1945. Okay, so make sure you have all those things in your timelines, and that's going to help you out as we get into Lesson 4, Modern Liberalism. So this is your ideological spectrum, and on the right side of the spectrum you have individualism. So the most individualist ideology that we learn about in this course is classical liberalism, which, as you know, was embraced by liberal democracies throughout the 1800s, right? Well, some people did not like classical liberalism very much, and they fully rejected classical liberalism, and they decided that they preferred an ideology that was more collectivist, and that ideology is communism, right? Which is one form of socialism. And classical liberals, they saw communism as a threat during the Industrial Revolution, and so over the years and over the decades, classical liberalism had to evolve, and eventually it evolved so much in the years between the two world wars and the years after the two world wars. It evolved so much that it was now a new form of liberalism, which we now call modern liberalism. And modern liberalism, it's really a mix of individualism and collectivism. So let's go back to the days of classical liberalism first. So in the early 1900s, the USA had embraced classical liberalism and laissez-faire capitalism as the country was industrializing. So this is what America was looking like at the time. They were building the railroads, they were connecting cities to each other, they were building factories, pretty much all those things you learned about happening in Europe, that was now happening in the United States. Okay, and the same amount of limited government led to the same amount of pollution and all that. So you have this in your partial notes. This is the economic cycle. Okay, so when you have a limited government and you have a free market capitalist economy, well, then the economy naturally goes through some cycles. So the economy will go through some peaks where the economy is doing well and there's lots of jobs and people have more money, but then inevitably it'll go through a recession, right? A recession is when the economy shrinks and we have more unemployment and there's less money in the economy, and then we go down to what's called a trough. But then eventually the economy recovers and we go back to another peak and we create more jobs and more money for more people, and people are buying houses and things become good again, right? And that's the peak. And then we go through another recession and then another recovery. And this is the natural economic cycle. According to capitalists, this is the natural economic cycle of a free market economy, right? So sometimes we, instead of the word peak, when when the economy is good, we call it a boom. So you can add the word boom here, right? Instead of peak, right? And sometimes when the economy is not so good, we call it a bust instead of a trough, okay? So you can go and add those words, okay? So let's see if I can make that happen for you here. Peak is also known as a boom, okay? And can I do another one? That's a boom, and then a bust. There we go. And a bust is down here when things are not going so well. Okay, maybe that wasn't the most beautiful way of doing it, but booms and busts or peaks and troughs. You get the idea. All right, so continuing. Let's go into the Roaring 20s in the 1920s. If you want, you can pause this video and you can watch this other video. All right, the link is in D2L. You can check that out, and it gives you sort of a crash course on what the Roaring 20s were like. So, 1920s, they were a time of urbanization, right? Meaning that people moved from the farms to the cities. They were a time of industrialization, right? So people started to work in factories and producing things using machines. And they were a time of increased prosperity, which means more money, right? Better paying jobs in the USA. The total wealth in the USA doubled from 1920 to 1929. Okay, so that's a huge increase. Okay, this is New York. All right, so you know this location. This is Times Square in the 1920s. All right, so it looks a little bit different, but essentially the same thing. So we see the birth of Times Square. And during this time, the rich got richer. The middle class also got richer. All right, and we had mass production, we had consumer spending reaching new heights. People were making more money and they were spending more money, and we were also producing more things, right? There was more stuff to buy with that new money, right? And electricity made its way into the countryside, right? So electricity made its way into the farms, and so people started to own refrigerators, fridges. It became normal for middle-class people to own an automobile and listen to a radio. Okay, there was no television yet. There was no TikTok yet. There was no internet, of course, right? But these are the things that people were starting to do. Beginning of automobile culture, right? And this was a time of urbanization. For the first time, there were more people in the cities than on the farms. However, the rural poor, meaning the poor people who lived on the farms, those people remained poor. Okay, so while there was a lot more money in the economy, most of that money actually went to the richest people. This was a time of inequality. By 1928, the wealthiest 10% of the population of the United States earned just under half of the income. Okay, so 10% of the people had more, just under half of all the money in the country. So very unequal. And this is what happens when we have limited government, a laissez-faire capitalist economy, right? It leads to inequality. You learned that in your last couple of lessons as well. Today, the wealthiest 10% own about 28%. Okay, so there's a lot of inequality still today, but even more so back in the 1920s. This was also a time during which governments were wanting to return to the ideals of classical liberalism. So after World War I, in light of the rise of socialism, right, we had seen the rise of labor unions, and we had seen better labor standards, better working environments, better wages, all of those things for the working class. President Harding was elected on this platform of a return to normalcy, is what he called it. So a return to classical liberalism, a return to laissez-faire capitalism. So these 1920s governments, you can consider them to be reactionary, right? Because they took their country back to the times of classical liberalism. So that included reduced income taxes. People were paying fewer taxes, and reduced corporate taxes as well. So corporations or companies were also paying fewer taxes, and overall a return to laissez-faire capitalism, right? This was also a time of bigotry, racism, and a lot of prejudice towards non-white people, right? So there was a reduced immigration policy that was put forward by the governments of the 1920s, especially President Harding. And the video that you watched a few minutes ago really breaks that down for you. So in the 1920s, part of the reason why there was so much production and so much money in the economy was because people were overusing or using too much credit to pay for purchases and investments. So how does credit work? Well, you typically get credit from banks. And so banks will lend money to a person, and that person can then use that money for a certain amount of time and spend it on whatever they want, as long as they pay the bank back in regular, smaller payments over the years. And during this time period, banks were lending too much money to people, right? So banks were over lending. Remember that this was a time of laissez-faire capitalism. So the government was not regulating loans. The government was not regulating banks giving money to people to spend. And so people kept on borrowing more and more money from the banks. They would take out double or extra mortgages on their house, and they would use that money to buy things like their automobiles and their fridges and their radios and all that. But also, they would use some of those loans to invest money in the stock market. How does that work? Well, I'm going to make this extremely simple, but if you invest money in the stock market, let's say you take $1,000 and you invest it in the stock market, and the stocks that you invest in grow, well, then your money also grows, right? So if you invest, let's say on this day here, you invested $1,000 and it was worth, your stocks were worth $100. Well, by the time you make it to this day over here, it's now worth $200, which means your $1,000 is now worth $2,000, right? And then if your money keeps on growing and growing and growing, gets to 400, well, now your money is worth $4,000, right? So people saw the stock market just continue to climb and climb and climb and climbing it better and better and better. So people would invest more and more of their money into the stock market. And on top of that, people would borrow money from the banks and invest the money that they borrowed into the stock markets as well, right? Which is awesome because people keep on making more and more money, except when this happens. The stock market crashed in 1929. So in your partial notes, you have a little picture of the stock market index. You can just add the crash part, right? Because your image only shows it going up and up and up. Add the part in which it crashes. This happened on October 29th, 1929. It was known as Black Tuesday, right? And this led to massive unemployment. It led to banks closing. It led to the Great Depression of the 1930s. So now the Roaring 20s came to a very quick end as people lost all of their life savings. As people lost all of their money, people lost their homes, and people ended up living like these guys right here, right? Unemployed, no work. In 1933, the unemployment rate in the US was 25%. So 1 out of 4 people had no job, and their average incomes dropped. They were cut in half. So basically, whatever amount of money people were making in the 1920s, it dropped by 50%. And so this led to this cycle of unemployment and low income and low spending. So basically, this cycle, the way it works is if you're not making money, well, then you can't spend money. So if a person becomes unemployed, they lose their job, well, then all of a sudden they have no income, they have no money, and so they don't spend money. And if they don't spend money, then businesses are not making money. And if businesses are not making money, what do they have to do to their employees? They have to lay them off. They have to fire their employees. And so that leads to more unemployment, which leads to less income again, and even less spending. And this is the cycle. It keeps on going around and around and around. That leads to more people living on the streets like this. And so people were climbing up on trains, leaving their hometowns and their home cities, hoping that they could find a job in other cities, right? But often they'd get to other cities and there would be no jobs in those cities either. And they'd tell them, no, keep going. We don't want you here. We already have enough homeless and unemployed people here that we can't even take care of them. So people would be forced to line up in lineups for charities. Some churches and private charities would give people suppers or lunches to help them stay alive. But it was really, really difficult to find a job that you could actually earn your own money, right? And on top of that, the people living in the farms, well, they still had their farms, except that the weather became really, really bad. They experienced a drought during this time, which means there was no rain. And so the soil became so dry that when the wind would blow, there would be these massive clouds of dust, right? These dust clouds. And so it was really damaging to people's lungs, and they'd have to wear these masks to make sure that they're not breathing in this dust. And so people lived in very desperate situations during this time. This is a photo, very well-known photo of a woman with her 2 kids. And here she is living not in a house, but she's living in sort of a tent, right? She's now homeless with her kids, and you can see the desperation in her face, right? And during all of this time, during this Great Depression, was the government intervening to help people, to make their lives better? Well, actually, no. In the 1930s, remember, this was a time of classical liberalism, right? So the government did not help the people. At the time, the president was President Herbert Hoover. Great name, not a great president, at least according to historians, because he didn't do much to help these people who were hurt. And he believed in limited government involvement in the economy. He believed the economy would eventually sort itself out, that eventually, this bust would become another boom, right? That the economic cycle would work out so that we go towards a recovery and the economy would be strong again in the future. Right? And he encouraged people to donate their money to private charities, but overall, he did not expect the government to do very much to help people. He did increase government spending a little bit, like a very, very small amount. For example, you probably heard of the Hoover Dam, right? The Hoover Dam is a big hydroelectricity project that was created during Herbert Hoover's presidency. Okay, but really overall, this was a time of very limited government. The federal government spending only made up about 3% of the total GDP of the country, right? So 3% versus today, it's about 20%, right? So back then, 3% is how much money the government would spend in the economy. Very limited government, whereas today, even though the United States still practices, some forms of limited government, they actually do spend a lot more money on their citizens. Okay, so people were in very desperate situations. This is a shanty town or a slum on the outskirts of Seattle, and here's another one on the outskirts of Brooklyn, and they called these places HOOVERVILLES, right? So you can take a look at the pictures in your partial notes of these 2 cities, and you can label them HOOVERVILLES, right? And they named them those. They gave them that name because they felt as if this is what happens when their president doesn't help them, right? They get stuck in a situation like this. And they also started calling these things Hoover wagons, right? So this was a car, or at least it used to be a car. They took out the engine because they can't afford to buy any gasoline anymore. And they hooked up some horses to it. Now, the horses are going to pull their car, and it's as if they're going back to the 1800s, right? And so they call it a Hoover wagon. In Canada, we had the same thing. We called it the Bennett buggy. Because of our Prime Minister Bennett, who also practiced some forms of limited government. So overall, in reaction to the Great Depression, many liberal democracies actually evolved, and they evolved to become welfare states. You're going to see in the second half of today's lesson, you're going to see that because of the Great Depression, because people were living in such terrible conditions during the Great Depression, liberal democracies like Canada and the United States and Western liberal democracies, they felt the need to develop welfare states. We're going to talk about what welfare states are. Basically, welfare states provide what's called a social safety net, right? A safety net is there to catch you when you're falling. Well, in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, people were falling, right? People were in trouble. The economy was falling. And so in a welfare state, it becomes the responsibility of the government to provide a safety net for people, right? That safety net could be things like employment insurance. That safety net could be things like today, CERB, right? The Canada Emergency Response Benefit. That safety net can include things like welfare, right? So these are things to help people in difficult situations. And as we developed welfare states, well, then our ideology evolved, right? So it was no longer classical liberalism. This was now modern liberalism. And the beginning of this, at least in the United States, the beginning of this was the election of this man right here, right? And his name was Franklin D. Roosevelt. We often call him FDR, right? Because of the initials of his name, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So he was elected in 1933, and he had this new program called the New Deal, right? So his New Deal increased government intervention in the country's economy, right? So he went from limited government to a government that actually invests money in its economy and does things to try to make the economy better. Okay, so in class, we're going to watch this video, 20th Century World History. There is a link to it in D2L. So go back to D2L and click on the link for FDR's New Deal. Okay, FDR's New Deal. And it's about a 19-minute video. You can go ahead and watch that. Okay. Welcome back from the video. So in this video, you learned about what are called the alphabet laws, right? So you had the AAA. This guaranteed a good price for grain, and it had farmers reduce output. And then you had the CCC, and this gave jobs to people to plant trees to prevent soil erosion. You also learned about the TVA, which created jobs to build dams to control flooding. You also learned about the NRA, right, which is different from the NRA that we have today in the United States, which is the National Rifle Association. This one in the 1930s, this was the National Recovery Administration, and it improved working conditions, it accepted unions, and also, very importantly, it created an old age pension and Social Security for American citizens. And then there was the WPA, the Workers' Program Administration, which created government-paid jobs for 8 million people, right? So these were not jobs in the private sector. These were jobs in the public sector, right? The government actually was creating jobs. The government felt it was its role to create jobs for its citizens, right? That's a big change in the way government thinks about its role in society. Okay, so here is FDR's inaugural address. This is the speech he gave when he became president. He said, "Our greatest primary task is to put people to work," right? So for the first time, he felt as if it's the government's job to intervene in the economy and actually make sure that people have jobs. He said, "This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself, treating the task as we would the emergency of a war, but at the same time, through this employment, accomplishing greatly needed projects to stimulate and reorganize the use of our national resources." So overall, you see government becoming involved, government taking a leadership role in ensuring that all people have jobs, and government not only just working for the rich elite, but working for more people in society. Okay, so his New Deal could be broken down into the 3 R's. All right, so we have relief, reform, and recovery. So relief means sort of help, right? So relief to the unemployed by creating jobs, right? And then reform to the economy, right? Reform means change, right? So changes to the economy. That meant regulating the banks, regulating the stock market, encouraging unions. So remember how the banks were a big part of how we got into this problem in the first place? They were lending too much money to too many people, including people who probably were not going to be able to pay that money back, right? And the stock market was a big part of how we got into this problem too. So he said that the government needs to intervene and regulate the banks, regulate the stock market, and also encourage unions, right? So you see that's more collectivist. All of these are more collectivist things, right? And help the economy recover from the Great Depression by creating things like Social Security, old age pensions, disability insurance, right? So all of these are very collectivist ideas. And so you see classical liberalism being pulled away from individualism and sort of taken towards the center of the ideological spectrum, where we now have some collectivist ideas being infused, right? So this was a time where there were a lot of changes, right, in the role of government in society, right? So we had an increased role of government, right? The government was now intervening. It was now believed that governments must soften the jagged edges of the market cycle. Okay, so remember the booms and the busts, right? The booms could be very high and the busts could be very low. Well, now it was believed that the economy instead should not have as big of booms and not have as low as of busts, right? That the economy should sort of be softened out a little bit, right? And doing all of this while still allowing people to have economic freedoms, right? To not take away people's right to own things and do what they want with their money, right? So governments must protect people from the abuses of uncontrolled capitalism.
Good morning, everybody. Breakfast is now being served at W104, so please grab something to eat at W104. Thank you.
Okay, so Breakfast Club is going on right now, so don't miss that. Yeah, so here's a speech from FDR about the forgotten man. He says, "These unhappy times call for the building of plans that rest upon the forgotten, that put their faith once more in the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid." Well, so all of a sudden, we see this change. We see this expansion of people that matter. Instead of it just being the rich people who own businesses and own land that matter, that are important in society, now these liberal principles, they apply to common people, right? Not just the industry bosses, right? And that's how classical liberalism is different from modern liberalism. In classical liberalism, rights and freedoms only extend to people who have money. But with modern liberalism, rights and freedoms are supposed to extend to all people, including the poor. And we even try to do more to help the poor in modern liberalism. So in your partial notes, there's a little sentence about modern liberalism. So this is still a liberal ideology. Okay, so modern liberalism is still part of liberalism, right? But it tries to fix inequality and injustices of capitalism while remaining focused on individual rights. So instead of the rich being more important than everybody else, in modern liberalism, we try to balance the scale a little bit. So in practice, what does it look like? It means more government spending. It means higher taxes than in classical liberalism. So the government takes more money from its citizens, but the government also does more things with that money and does things to help people in society. Okay, it includes what's called a progressive taxation. So take a look at this chart. Take a moment, pause, look at this chart. This is progressive taxation in Canada. So how does that work? If you make about $47,000 or less in Canada, your federal tax is going to be 15% on that money. However, for every dollar that you make that is more than $47,630, those dollars are going to be taxed at 20.5%, right? And so all the money that you make that is more than $47,630, all the way up to $95,259, that money is going to be taxed at 20%. But if you make more money than that even, well, that extra money is going to be taxed at 26%. And if you make more than $147,667, well, then that extra money is going to be charged or is going to be taxed at 29%. And overall, if you make over $210,371, all of the money that you make that is more than this will be taxed at 33%. So 1/3 of it will go to the government. So that means the more money you make, the more money you have to give to the government at a higher percentage. This is called progressive taxation. Okay, so this also includes an increase in public property. So crown corporations are what we call them in Canada. So these are government-owned businesses, and we have more of these in modern liberal countries than we did in classical liberal countries. Okay, so think about some of the crown corporations, the government-owned businesses that we have in Canada, such as the CBC. We have Farm Credit Canada, which gives better, it gives loans at better interest rates to our farmers. We have Via Rail to encourage, transportation throughout Canada, although it's not very cheap, so I don't know why. And then we also have Canada Post, which delivers your mail for you. These are all owned by the government, okay, and meant to be public property, right? And so these are all owned by the federal government. We also have public property in municipal governments, right? So think about our transit system, right? The buses and the trains. That is all public property. So in a modern liberal country, we have more public property like that. Okay. It also meant the implementation of the welfare state. So the welfare state, we talked about it a minute ago, a few minutes ago. The welfare state is a society in which the government plays a large role in providing for the needs and the well-being of its citizens. When we have a welfare state, the government's job is to make sure that your life is not too bad, all right? Making sure that you have basic things to survive. Things like public education, all right? All of a sudden, this became purple, don't know why, but go ahead and add these things to your partial notes. Public education, healthcare, right? So in Canada, you go to see a doctor, well, you don't pay, right? It's funded through our tax dollars. Employment or disability insurance, right? This is part of the social safety net, right? So if you lose your employment, right, you lose your job, well, then we have employment insurance that is there as a safety net to catch you. Or if you become disabled, we have disability insurance that is there to catch you and make sure you don't hurt yourself, right? We have public housing. Public housing is when the government creates houses for our poorest people, houses that are cheaper or sometimes even free. And social assistance and old age pensions, which is money that you receive when you become old. Because when you're old, it's harder to work, right? And so some people, when they're old, they're vulnerable. And so the government gives them some money every month. But remember, it's not very much money, okay? So don't depend on that when you get old. And all of these things are provided for free or at a low cost. And these are all called social programs, okay? So whenever we talk about social programs, we're talking about these things right here that are provided by your government for society, for people, okay? And so there are different degrees of government intervention in different modern liberal countries, different degrees of government intervention in different welfare states, right? And so it depends, if you live in the United States, the welfare state is smaller than if you live in a place like Sweden, where the welfare state is very big. And we're going to talk about countries like Sweden in your next lesson, democratic socialism. Okay, so anyway, that's that for today. That is your lesson 4. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a few things, and have a good day.